so. They got new chairs this year. I remember because there was discussion of where the old chairs were. I don't remember.
So do you know why they don't do it over here? Is it just because
It's
citizens?
a workshop,
Oh,
so
okay.
workshops take place in the cane room for better discussion.
The majority of workshops do.
Okay.
You know, there are times where we'll have workshops here within a regular meeting. It's rare, but we do.
Okay.
But most of them take place in the Boston.
I guess it would be nice if these chairs have those seats like at the airport, you know, kind of, or like there's your seat in your.
Yeah, like in college.
Yeah.
Or if there was more than one plug in this whole room.
Or if I had a couple there.
Yeah.
That would have encouraged people.
That's even-
I know, no,
It's
Linda
even
would
more important.
scout. She would
It's
scout.
more important.
Not you, Linda.
That's awesome.
Department of Innovation, we can suggest an innovation.
That's a sweet idea, budget.
Exactly.
Lights on, please.
Tell me what you.
Outlets in every seat.
Just leave it on your microphone.
Exactly.
There you go. Good evening. Welcome to the City Council Budget Meeting, Friday, August the 6th. Welcome to the new council members, your first budget meeting out of 5 or 6. It's going to be a great time for all. Item number 1, public comment. Anybody that wants to speak on the item, which is the budget, is welcome to do so at this time. Thomas, you said we didn't have anybody. They won't have anybody. Move on to item number 2A. Review of and discussion on proposed fiscal year 2022 annual budget, 5-year capital improvement program, 22 through 26, inclusive of all funds and forecasts. We've got Jennifer May, Deputy City Manager, Scott Butler, Director of Budget and Strategy, and Jennifer Brown, Director of Finance. Jennifer.
Right, good morning. So I'm up here again on behalf of a big team. Scott and Justin and Allie and Sylvia, Rosita and Jennifer did all of the hard work. I'm just gonna be up here presenting. And then Jennifer will do a separate presentation on property tax at the end of this. I tried to get her to just do the whole thing, but it felt unfair to make her type 2 PowerPoints right now. So, so we are letting her focus on what she is best at. So, with all of that said, it's a pleasure to be here, and just know that depending on what questions you ask, if you need the answers, you may get answers from a whole team of people. All right, so just the format of the budget workshops for those of you who are pros at this point. This won't be anything new for those of you who are new. Just want to let you know that these are really your opportunity to ask questions. We'll go into a little bit more detail in the budget than we did at the filing time. And then for questions, we have a practice of keeping track of those questions, putting them together in a matrix or spreadsheet, and then pulling the answers together and sending them to the full city council so that you can make sure that you have all the follow-up information that you need. And really, the goal of all of this is to provide you the information that you need that will allow you to make an informed decision and a confident decision in September when the budget comes to you for formal approval. So for FY22, and I'm not going to repeat all of the strategy that you heard in May and in July when we filed, that is all still true. But just to recap the high points, our fiscal year 22 budget is still, we're focused on being responsible, conservative, and resilient. And so for us this year, that looks at balancing both the financial integrity of the city with operational stability. I joke that it's really easy to make the finances look good. I just tell all the people in this room no to any of their requests. And I can do my job easily, but you wouldn't have much in the way of services being provided to residents. That operational stability is really important. We're also really looking to build on the success of the strategies that we implemented last year when we first saw COVID becoming a thing. And then we're starting to have some guarded optimism regarding the recovery, but even that, the world feels a little more uncertain than it did a few weeks ago when we presented the filed budget to you. So we are continuing to identify strategies to offset some of that risk. You'll see an emphasis on phased restoration of funding levels for our priority services, with an emphasis even further on those that are highest and most important to our community, whether that's infrastructure, mobility, even special events, and of course, public safety. Today's workshop is focused on the general fund and property tax. And so we kind of highlighted this a few weeks ago, but the general fund is the primary operating fund for the city. Essentially, it accounts for all activity that is not legally required to be accounted for separately. And so the things that you think of as most traditional as being provided by a city are in the general fund. So your public safety, your public works, streets, drainage, even parks, and then some of the environmental and neighborhood services. And you'll see in some coming slides that it is primarily funded by property tax and sales tax revenue. So some principles that guide us in our financial management overall, and specifically for the general fund, is that we are structurally balanced, which means recurring revenues exceed recurring expenditures. That does not mean that we don't draw down fund balance as it's available for one-time expenditures, but on the whole, we are structurally balanced. We like to have fund balance above the policy for the entire forecast period. And then we really, like I said, focus on the sustainability of our programs and services, as well as making sure that we are investing in the championship workforce, because without them, we wouldn't be able to provide services. And then this year, looking at really trying to further kind of take the step of reinvesting in the Sugarland way. And like I mentioned, balancing that opportunity and risk. So you'll see on the slide some pie charts of kind of the context of the total budget. And so we have about $290 million in revenues, just under $300 million in expenditures. And so the thing that's interesting to me here is that the general fund is the most complex, it's the most sensitive, it's the most visible fund that we have, but in truth, it's this year only about a third of the total budget. So there's a lot of financial planning and services that are provided outside of the general fund. Looking specifically here, about $98 million in revenues, about $102.5 million in expenditures. And again, that includes the planned drawdown of fund balance. We are structurally balanced. And as I've shared with you before, my favorite part about the general fund is police, dispatch, and fire EMS make up over 40% of our budget, and property tax alone does not fully fund those departments. So looking at revenues, this is just a look at the operating revenues for fiscal year 21 and how we're doing. And so what you will see is that sales tax, which is the top bar, is doing really well, far above what we projected. We have a slide with more detail on that in a minute. That is partially offset by declines in the other revenues, whether that's mixed beverage, charges for services, licenses and permits, and those things. So the sales tax performance is provided a buffer against some other areas of decline.
But Jennifer, it's still not back to where it was in 2019.
What was the next slide? You're good at this. Yes. So as the mayor, right. So as the mayor said, it is great news that we are doing better than we thought we would be doing this current year. But the hard part is we're not back to where we thought we would be. And so we are just, you can see we are doing better than 19, but we're essentially, I would say, even with 19. And then the harder part is if you go back to the fiscal year 20 budget book and you see where we were projecting we would be in terms of revenue by 22, we're far below that in the tune of about $4 to $5 million. So you've really seen a 2-year reset. So at best, even this overperformance is really just helping us mark time. It's not making progress on those investments into the Sugarland way that you made in 2020. So this is a closer look at sales tax. And so just some things to point out here. The chart on the right, which is the last full fiscal year, really shows you the makeup of our sales tax base. And so it's dominated by retail trade and food and entertainment, with a really healthy portion from what I call more business generated sales tax. And so this is great in good years because it means that our sales tax base is largely, there's significant portions of it that are generated by non-residents coming in to our city and by the business sector. That's a little bit harder in the off years. This is already a volatile revenue source, really our most volatile revenue source. And then to have such elastic categories like retail and food and entertainment dominating it, that just makes it that much more volatile in the hard years. And so this time last year, we were before you talking about how conservative should we be in our projections. And so the chart shows you where we landed on that. And so we projected 6 months of significant decline in retail and in food and entertainment. And so we outperformed that, which is a great thing. The retail number I questioned, I was like, how were we up? And Justin reminded me that the beginning of the year we saw significant declines. And then as we've seen recovery start happening, we've had such good months recently that it's kind of skewed that a little bit. But you can see the significant decline in food and entertainment there. And so overall, this is a bright spot. You can see that through July, we've in total for the general fund, we're nearly at budget with 2 months remaining. And so that's great for this year because it takes pressure off of needing to do additional strategies to mitigate the impact of the economic downturn. But really at this point, it's more beneficial for us next year because this is really what's helping provide the one-time funding to do some limited additions next year. So any questions on sales tax? I know this is a complicated slide. And just generally, if you have questions throughout, don't hesitate to interrupt me. Right. So this is just looking at kind of our sales tax projection for fiscal year 22. And so if you'll recall, the financial management policy statements say that we will budget for recurring revenue only. And so we use this year's recurring to project next year's budget. And so when I was before you in May talking about assumptions, we had said that we were going to follow the financial management policy statements, but add in some targeted additions, recognizing that there would be additional recovery in some of our sectors, the Smart Financial Center, et cetera. What has happened is the months in between there, so June and July, were such good sales tax months for us that it's really lessened the need to add additional revenue above policy so that you can barely even see the gray bar all the way over to the right. So we're essentially following policy at this time. 2 weeks ago, I think I was ready to get to work and look at like, should we increase that number? I will tell you that with the just kind of re-emerging uncertainty. And then also we just don't know what the impact of things like the Comptroller's sales tax rule changes that go into effect in October. I, at this point, would recommend keeping it really conservative and just kind of mitigate the risk that way rather than get too excited about recovery that still is a little uncertain.
Jennifer, do you have any more details about the Comptroller's proposed changes?
So the hard part on the Comptroller rule changes is you need really detailed information about business operations to be able to compare business operations to the new rules. And it's really intricate, and the businesses don't tend to like us getting in their financials, and they're just really suspect of us being like, hey, we're from the government. Can we learn the details of your business so that we can talk about sales tax? But we're doing everything that we can to talk to our existing businesses and make sure that we have a good understanding. So at this point, it's not something we're overly concerned about, but we are cognizant of it and we'll be watching it carefully. But it's really kind of around the definition of a place of business, if that, like making sure that people aren't finding loopholes in the rules to aggregate sales tax in one place to then enter into sales tax sharing agreements. So it's just kind of trying to make sure the distribution is fair across the state is the easiest way to explain it. But if you want more information, happy to get it for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So on other revenues, this chart shows you both kind of how we're doing this year and what we're looking forward to next year. So fines and forfeitures, we have seen a decline this year with just kind of the shutdown and also not being able to hold court for much of the year. And so for next year, we'll be resetting that to this year's original budget. Mixed beverage and licenses and permits are both really pretty much on track. And so we'll be looking in this year's budget to return those to like fiscal year 19's actuals. Electric franchise fees, this is a number, we get a letter telling us what those will be, and it will be a decrease. And so I think that's largely due to just overall, when you have a lot of businesses that don't have people there, it turns out they use less electricity, which means we get less in the way of franchise fees. And then charges for services this year still seeing a decline with the prolonged shutdown largely in areas like parks. And then next year, the fiscal year 22 budget is built around a blended CPI increase of 3%. So if we'd used February's CPI, it would have been around that like 1%. If we used April, it would have been 4.5%, and that felt high. So we settled on a more typical 3% increase. Any questions on revenues? All right, expenditures. Here are the pie charts here. Again, one on the left showing you the breakdown again by department, the public safety department's dominating it. And then on the right showing you that it is, our budget is largely personnel with only about a quarter of it being operations. And this isn't surprising. Our championship workforce is the backbone of the services that are provided. You can't have a police department without police officers. Rob and Brian can't get sidewalks fixed without people to fix them. And so we take a lot of pride in being a public service and personnel driven organization. The base budget does include our standard personnel cost increase, which includes the 3% merit, which is a performance-based recognition of employees. It does also, it's not listed explicitly on the slide, includes the second phase of the public safety compensation study implementation, and then includes some structure moves for the general employees that are not across the board increases. And Paula, who just walked in, will be giving you later on in August a much more detailed look at compensation, but just wanted to recognize that it is in the base budget. And then you'll also see reflected in the base the continued implementation of the strategies that we put in place last year. And so that includes the first phase of the planned rehab restoration, the planned restoration of workforce development funding. You will see, or we included kind of a modified restoration of fleet and high tech, focusing still primarily on the public safety needs there, but giving ourselves a little bit more time to fully restore that funding. We then, as we talked about, have avoided the need for the long-term position elimination through the use of one-time merit this current year. And then we are maintaining, the departments did not love us, but they understood we're champions about it, where we had to make operational budget cuts last year to help balance everything. We are carrying forward those with only limited restoration there. This chart you've seen before just puts the merit pool into context. And then on kind of our strategies, I've talked about the downside risk. We'll be looking to really continue monitoring things through the first quarter, and then we'll make decisions on the timing of merit pool implementation. A portion we're holding about half of the one-time budget requests right now is what our plan is, and we'll make a decision on those. And then rehab funding, we may look at some time to release there. And then this fall, we'll be back with you to talk about how to allocate the federal funding through the American Rescue Plan. And again, just gives us more time to make sure we're making the best decisions, and also allows us to move forward with the highest priority steps in returning to the Sugarland line. So this is a slide you saw from the filing presentation, where we talked about the categories of the highest priorities of things that are receiving funding. So those were base budget, operational stability, the public safety investments, community priorities, citizen engagement. And then, like you learned at the governance retreat, we have funding in there to turn disruptions into new opportunities. And this is really just part of that recognition that disruptions are inevitable, but we do have to be intentional about reconciling them and making sure that we're becoming better than we were before. So looking at this in a little bit more detail of the funding that is added in this year, about 80% of it is one time. And so you'll see about $850,000 in essentially base requests and then about $3 million in one-time priorities. Overall, the recurring increases are focused on those base budget things that are contractual increases, CPI adjustments, software license increases. There's a significant portion of it that is related to public safety equipment, their software training, and just general operations, and then continued implementation of the ERP. One thing to note is that of the one-time funding, many of the things that we are giving one-time funding to or recommending one-time funding for are truly probably recurring needs over the long time, and we are patching them with one-time funding this year. And so this is just some important context. And then, as I mentioned, we'll be holding approximately half of those until first quarter mid-year, and then really all of this, the larger conversation will happen this fall with you at the fall retreat about recurring revenue needs, service level expectations, and where we want to go. So looking at the one-time expenditures in a little bit more detail, it is still a somewhat high-level summary. I'll step you through some examples. If you have any questions, there are a lot of experts in this room that can help provide more detail. But starting with infrastructure rehab, there's about $700,000 built in that allows us, first and foremost, to provide supplemental funding for sidewalks, which allows us to really focus on eliminating the current backlog that exists and getting caught up there. And then it also allows us, if you remember a few slides ago, I mentioned that we had planned to restore rehab funding that we cut last year over 2 years. We also have a supplement built in there that allows us to really achieve that full restoration this year beyond the supplement. Special events, we have about $260,000, which combined with some funding in the special events fund will allow for full funding of 4th of July and achieving near stabilization of event funding overall for the Parks Department. Joe, the work that y'all have done this year to provide events that are kind of new and different to provide community in the midst of COVID is just, it's been really great. So then we have public safety, and that's about $500,000. So that includes, this is where we have the funding built in for some enhancements to the public safety training facility, recognizing that if we're able to move forward with those quicker, we'll use contingency this year and do that. There's some expanded police department facility lease space. The LPR, license plate recognition camera system, has another study. This was actually an item that had one-time funding in FY20. They got delayed when COVID happened. And then again, just some more operational stability for the public safety departments. Mobility and traffic safety, about $350,000. You did receive an update on the mobility master plan phase 2. And then there's also funding in for traffic signal generators, traffic control, safety equipment, and then our dynamic messaging signs and roadway lighting maintenance. So just generally things that are related to keeping people traveling safe. Then significant amount, over 650 for the maintenance of service levels. And so this is, and again, these are not exhaustive lists, but examples including continuation of the second courtroom so that we can maintain a level of service for those going through that process. There's some things that are related to maintaining the appearance of our city, which was one of the kind of pillars of the Sugarland Way. Things like freeze-related plant replacement, another Sugarland Way item for the infrastructure communications master plan, just limited restoration of prior funding cuts, and then some investments in helping take better care of our frontline employees. On the citizen engagement side, you'll see a few things related to just engagement, whether that is a new app with the new ERP and some enhancements to our ability to do videography and put messages out to the community. And then lastly, about 550 for that disruptions into opportunity, which is largely reserves for innovation and contingency, but also making sure that we're making investments in workplace technology. So since the world's kind of changed around how we meet, And then also some funding for future master plan updates and looking to things like preparing for an eventual comprehensive plan update. And so in total, it's a little over $3 million in one-time funding. And like I said, several of the things in here, I mean, events is a great example that's being given one-time funding, but really are more recurring needs. So at this point, I'll pause on this and see if anyone has any questions on these items.
Sean?
Jennifer, infrastructure rehab, with our survey and everything else that we've done, we've heard our citizens loud and clear. The 710,000, you used the word eliminate the backlog. I know the current backlog is 18 to 24 months is what the customer or resident is facing. Is it going to eliminate that 18 to 24 months?
I'm going to let Brian butcher
I figure he's right.
I will also, before he answers, because I know what his answer will be, I will tell you that rehab is one of those that is high on the list of if the recovery is stronger than we've budgeted for, will be at the top of a list for consideration for additional funding mid-year, but I'll let Brian answer.
So our current backlog is roughly 1,000 service requests, okay? With the money that she's talking about there, along with the ongoing money that we have recurring, we will be able to complete right at about 1,000 service requests. So we will be able to knock out the service requests we currently have in-house. Over the last few years, we've received between 800 and 1,000 service requests every year. So yes, we will knock out the backlog, but all of the service requests that we get in 22 will now be, in the 2023 money to doing that. So we will take that 18 to 24 and make it a 12 to 15 or 12 to 18 month window. That's what we do. That makes sense? Okay, thank you.
I've got a follow-up on that one. So the 1.125 million includes the $710,000 then?
So it really includes, it's 500 that's being supplemented for sidewalks, and then overall the additional difference between 500 and 700 is getting distributed across other categories that impact cuts as well.
Okay. So my understanding is about $6.1 million of outstanding sidewalk rehab needed. So when we talk about the backlog, you're just talking about people who actually have filed service requests for the city, and the difference between that and the 6.1 million is the stuff that the city has identified through its annual sidewalk.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. We walk every mile of sidewalk in the city every year, and we record the condition. Our recorded condition identified about $6 million in necessary repairs. But we focus on the service, the calls we get from residents. And so the money that we'll be spending next year will be focused on knocking out the residents' calls, and we will continue to have that other not the full $6 million, right? It's fair to assume that $6 million was captured all the service requests. So we'll knock out the service requests next year.
So is there any chance we could use some of the governmental funding to help with this? Because we're not going to have $6 million, I said, obviously every year recurring. So can we use part of that?
That's one of the things.
So we don't have to push the new stuff into FY23.
Yep, that's one of the things absolutely that we'll be looking at.
Suzanne, did you have a question?
Yes, that was my question. We could use allocations from ARPA to help us.
Yep. Well, that's the top of the list to evaluate.
I've got a question. So I noticed on the budget for patrol, line item for that is decreasing. Can someone go into a little bit of detail about that?
Can you tell me, I'm going to probably need help.
What page are you on?
I'm on page 68 of the summary of expenditures for the general fund. Under environmental and neighborhood services, the patrol line item, where we're at, it's going down for this fiscal year 22 budget. I'm just curious as to, are we going to pay in that area? Are we?
This one, 13.15 to 12.8. Is that what you're looking at?
That's what she's looking at. My guess is that
the overall, it's probably
carryovers.
Because the 21 current budget is going to include the carryover from fiscal year 20, and then there are any one-time budget, any one-time funding in 21, which I don't really recall off the top of my head. That's more than likely the difference, but we can get that answer for you.
That's my guess as well, is that it's one-time funding or carryovers from last year. That's why the 21 budget is higher, because if we compare it to the 20 actuals, it's almost $500,000 higher, so, but we'll pull the detail for you.
Okay. Okay, William?
So everyone had a very difficult time adjusting to what we experienced in the unknown of COVID. And so now we're stepping into, I guess just last night, even Harris County raised their concern level to red for Delta and whatever else. How does this plan that I'm reading, I mean, this is a massive amount of, intellect and planning. Are we considering, and I'm assuming we are, the worst case of Delta / whatever's next for this so that we continue to be successful with our planning? And these are assumptions. As I read your ideas, I'm thinking we just don't know what is coming at us as opposed to pretending it's, in my mind, I want to think it's all over.
Right.
I want to say we're in full recovery, but are we preparing for another year of what we've just been through?
Sure. So what I'll tell you is, yes, we are. We're being extremely conservative, I believe, in our sales tax projections. We also, the strategies that I talked about of us not making decisions on merit for half of our one-time budget requests, and then potentially holding portions of rehab and other things. And then coupled with the availability of the American Rescue Plan funds, I believe we're doing everything that is responsible for us to do. Sure, we could do more. There would be service level impacts to that. But what I do want to say is that if we end up having to use some of those strategies that I outlined, you'll feel the impact of those. The residents will, when we have to pull back on services, if we end up, worst case, having to put a hiring freeze back into place, the departments will feel that. So we're doing everything that we can to protect the financial integrity of the city and balance that with operational stability. But if we end up back in a worst case scenario, you're going to feel the impact of it, but we'll be okay. It'll just hurt a little bit, if that makes any sense.
Sure, and sort of a follow-up to our expenditure on salaries and all. That's the big piece. So it's almost $103 million. And again, I've not gone through every line item. I rely a lot on these reports that I'm given. And that is a lean number, I am assuming, based on your studies of the $102.8 million.
Yeah. We look more at overall employees per capita and our total employment versus percentage of the general fund. So, but overall, when we do peer city comparisons, we are a very lean city. And that is impressive when you consider that we have a water utility, we provide EMS and fire outside of our city limits, we have an airport and other things. So I'm very confident that we are a lean city overall.
Mm-hmm. So you just brought up the airport. I feel like that's one of our jewels in what Sugarland really is. And so the $103 million, the airport, correct me if I'm wrong, kind of supports itself in a very positive way.
Yep, it's a totally separate fund.
Okay, we're not feeling a negative impact of them at all on the 102.
No,
okay.
we don't feel their positive impact, but we don't feel their negative in the same way. The water utility is a completely separate fund. So those will be the later presentations, but you're absolutely right.
Those are the inputs.
Yep. All right. Any other, is there?
On special events, the 260,000 more. I know you've always done a 4th of July program, and I see it highlighted there. So what is there anything else there as well, or is it just the 4th of July program?
No, this is our whole budget for the year no. It's more than just 4th of July.
Like the Kite International Festival, maybe included.
We've got 23, 24 events scheduled for FY22. So we have had fluctuation in funding for July 4th over the last several of years. And so kind of part of why that says stabilizing it is just to try to get a more
Get it back up.
established level. It also helps us kind of leverage more of the sponsorships by having that set funded there that we know we're going to be able to have that each year.
But so 4th of July funding for context hasn't, like Joe said, it's not been stable over the years. We had it fully sponsored 1 year, and then we've taken an approach of this year predominantly we used, or we're prepared to use, parking revenues that we had received from the Smart Financial Center that we've put into the special events fund, but those dollars on this side of last year are not available. So there's some funding that's needed for this year, but our goal long-term is to get that to be a more self-supporting event with special event revenues.
Thank you.
All right, anything else?
I just had one more. I don't know if this is the time to ask, but I was just, we could get an update on, we took over mowing our, we changed from going through contract to taking that in-house. Can we get an update on how that's going?
Would you like a financial update or as a
Just
whole?
overall,
So everything that we put into the model that we presented to y'all that presented hundreds of thousands of dollars in savings every year, we have kept with. We did not, the FTE count we needed, we've used the amount of mowers and all of that. We followed that business plan to a T. I personally, now that we've stopped raining, think our right-of-ways are looking better than ever. The biggest thing holding us back right now is what we lost in the freeze, and there's money for next year and doing a lot of that replacement. So as a whole, we're keeping up. We're following the business plan that we brought y'all, which includes the savings that we were hoping to see. And we get compliments all the time about the quality of the work that our staff do. It's hard because we've had a lot of turnover. People are moving on to bigger and better jobs, but we stay staffed up and we're keeping up with the work.
So they're able to have work year round?
Oh, yes, ma'am, absolutely. So when the grass goes dormant, we spend all winter replanting, cleaning out beds. We have mowing throughout the year that isn't as regular as in the summertime, but during the winter times, we're busy all year. Actually, that's probably our busiest time of year. So we're staying busy.
And so how much are we saving every year with taking that in-house?
So do you know that number? Just shy of $200,000 a year per year. Yes, which is built into Jennifer's financial.
Okay.
All right. The next slide just puts rehab into some context. And so the third chart from the left is the FY22 amount. And so you'll see with the one-time sidewalk supplement and the additional one-time supplement to kind of get us fully back to where we thought we would be. We're right around where we were in 20. We're above where we thought we would be in 22 and 20 because fiscal year 20 had some one-time funding. But long-term, this is where some of the conversation this year at the fall retreat will be, is that Sugarland Way plan had some additional dramatic increases and investments in rehab funding over the forecast. And that's the part where we're struggling right now to be able to provide that. And so that will be a big part of the conversation this fall. And then this is just a look at the breakdown, again, not fully meeting the Sugarland Way, but sidewalks being the big winner there with over $1 million of the total. And I will tell you that throughout the year, there are sometimes changes to this. So it's not etched in concrete, but it just gives you a sense of where the rehab dollars go. So then looking to—
Jennifer, I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
This may be a stupid question.
There are no stupid questions.
Sidewalk and trail rehab is one, but what's pavement rehab? What's the difference? Streets. Okay.
And if I didn't answer that correctly, Brian, you just tell me I was wrong.
And that is in addition to the investment from the CIP. So we have $1 million in Geo Bond funding to the CIP for pavement.
That's usually annual replacement.
That's what it is.
So we don't have potholes in Sugarland, so.
We do, we got one or two.
They get fixed.
They just move around.
Share them with Missouri City.
So, all right, so then looking.
No cost.
Oh, yeah.
All right, looking to the forecast, just some high level information on the assumptions that are built in here. You will see property tax is built in accordance with the financial management policy statements and the voter approval rate at that 3.5% increase. Then sales tax, we are still being in this, Mr. Ferguson, to your question about are we prepared for the worst case? Not only are we being conservative in the 22 budget with sales tax, but we identified kind of how you grow sales tax across the forecast is another really big place of risk. And so we're being more conservative than what the financial management policy statements would say for that. And so we, of course, using last year's recurring plus just a little for 22. 23 would grow by CPI or 3%, whichever is less. And so we're using the 1.5 CPI number when really we could use 3. Then for 24, you would normally under policy grow that at another 3%. But instead of doing that, we're kind of just saying, let's just budget for FY19 actuals at that point and say that like we're back to kind of where we are. And then using the 3% beyond that. And so there's a lot, I will just, I mean, this is a conservative, resilient plan on sales tax. And then my hope is that we are back to you next year with some really good news on how that's performing. And then there is, as we talked about at your May retreat on budget, we do have $3 million in additional recurring revenues built in for fiscal year 23 to kind of help.
Jennifer, apologies. Stuart's got a question.
Councilman, your audio,
We
can you try to reconnect your
understand
audio?
what you're saying. We can't, it's a bad connection, break up.
Is it working?
We're hearing something, but it's not you.
Okay, all right. Again, maybe it's.
Or if you want to try to type it in the chat, I can read it into the record for you.
Yeah, if you'll text it in to us, Stuart, then Tom, text it to me or to Mike, and we'll get Thomas to read it in the record.
All right. While we're waiting on that, one. Okay, so we do have the $3 million of additional recurring revenue that's really just part of needing to kind of offset the reset. And that is where we'll have a lot of conversation at the fall retreat, both around revenue or service level reductions or any combination thereof. On the expenditure side, as I mentioned in July, we do have the final phase of public safety compensation built in fiscal year 23. Our hope that's another one that we would like to accelerate if we're able to. And then we have the replacement of the CAT RMS, or what I call our 911 system, and then 3% merit, again, performance-based across the forecast period.
Question.
Yes, ma'am.
On the property tax, 3%, 3.5% increase, is that based on revenues from sales or property tax increase values?
It is any combination of revaluation and new value. And so we, prior to Senate Bill 2, and Jennifer will get into some of this more in her segment of the presentation, but essentially the financial management policy statements say that we will budget for M&O revenue, which is the revenue from property tax using the general fund, in accordance with the voter approval rate. So at 3.5%, and that is really just maintenance kind of increases to the property tax rate. It's also the most you can do under Senate Bill 2 without going to voters for the for an election.
Jennifer was also going to read Stuart's comment on the chat.
With all the possible outperformance because of the conservative forecasting, does that then leave a lot of discretionary spending to staff that doesn't have to pass by the city council?
No, it's a great question. It doesn't, because any outperformance would fall to the bottom line. And so the only things that we can spend are the appropriated expenditures. And so if there's outperformance on revenue, it's not an appropriated expenditure. So the only thing that we can spend is what is in there. And so we would have to come back to kind of take advantage of overperformance. We would have to come back to you for a mid-year budget amendment. And it is our hope that we're doing that at the time that we bring you carryovers, that we've been able to capture that we're more confident of where things are. So
Jennifer, why don't you go through the carryovers, because very often we do have carryovers in the budget. How it works, we typically hold them until certain times.
Yeah, so in essence, we can only spend money in accordance with an appropriated adopted budget. And so we, as a governmental entity, do that on an annual basis. And so if, let's say, the police department got money for a big study, and they started that last year, and they don't finish it, that money does not automatically roll over to be appropriated in the next year's budget. And so when we get through year end, we have to recognize, okay, here are all the things that we had underway that we didn't finish doing. And so let's take that money that's left over to do those things that you adopted last year and add it to the appropriation for this year. And so that's where, kind of to Councilmember Lane's question on that line item budget, it can get really confusing when you're trying to compare to a current, like the column that says current budget versus next year's, because it will include those things that were adopted and appropriated the prior year that got brought over as well.
Same thing happens on CIP.
CIP is budgeted on a project basis, so those funds actually do kind of transcend fiscal years, which makes it all the more confusing because it's not consistent.
But you could have savings that could end up being
absolutely
reappropriated to other projects at the end of the year.
Right, yeah, so a CIP project, if you have savings there, you can do more things on that project, but if you want to use it for another one, it would require a budget amendment.
And we do have to come back to you for that. The operating funds, the appropriation lapses at year end. And so we can't do anything until we come back to you. We have to be authorized to spend that in the current fiscal year, which is what we call the carry process.
Yeah, so the only discretionary things that we ever have are the contingency dollars that are built in. We talked about a little bit of an increase there. But even that, anything over $50,000 would have to come to you for approval too. So.
Stuart, you okay?
Great. Excellent. So then looking at the forecast, this is of course a slide, but some things that I'd like to point out is you will see in the second column for fiscal year 21 projections, we are projecting to end the year very strong. That really, you can see across the forecast, allows us to do one-time additions in multiple years and do planned drawdowns of that fund balance for those one-time expenditures. And then you can see the structural balance in FY26 to the extent that net income is positive there, and that we have positive dollars in the fund balance above our 25% operating reserve requirement. And so, any questions on the forecast? All right. Well, this is about to wrap up my portion of this morning. So this is just a look at your next few weeks of budget workshops. I will tell you that I anticipate having additional conversation on property tax next week, as you'll hear from Jennifer, that while we have some information, it is so hot off the presses that we have not even had time to review it in detail or figure out how to advise you on what to do with it. And then for the truth in taxation process that is very regimented under state law, you'll take a record vote August 17th to then publish the proposed tax rate, and we'll do a public hearing on that in September prior to presentation for adoption. And then just another look at those same key dates with the budget public hearing added in. And so I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have on the general fund.
We're good to go.
All right.
Good for me.
Got a question from Councilman Davis.
Okay. Go ahead, read it in time.
Yes, sir.
Can we go into deeper into reserves if forecasts don't bear out, or do we need to do a budget amendment?
Into the operating reserve or contingencies?
All the operating reserves.
He's asking if our revenues don't come in, can we then, as long as the funds are appropriated, we can then utilize the reserves as a drawdown to replace the revenues? Is that essentially what you're asking, Councilmember? Okay, yes, we can do that. And so what we would do is we would just recognize the fact that the revenues have not come in, and that we would be utilizing those revenues to fund those expenditures. As long as the expenditures are appropriated, we can do that. But we would have that discussion with the city council before we do that.
And I think you would also have us, if it were severe enough to warrant a lot of conversation or a severe debate, you would have us outlining mitigation strategies to avoid needing to do it to that extent as well. So it would be part of that.
Definitely.
Okay.
Up here where I can reach it a little bit easier. All right. Okay. So I think we've actually got the caption kind of, so this is really a continuation of item A. So I'm going to be covering the property tax portion of the budget workshop, and then we have the second item on the agenda is the truth in taxation calculations, where we just need to read the report that we've received some information into the record at the request of the tax assessor. So property tax is one of the main revenue sources for both the general fund and the debt service fund. It is one of the few revenue streams that the city has control over, in the fact that the city council can set the tax rate that is necessary to generate the revenue to support the operating expenses and the debt service payments. You can't control the values that is set by the Central Appraisal District, but you can control the tax rate within the limits of the increases set by the state legislature, which is what we call Senate Bill 2, where we have the 3.5% increase on maintenance and operations. So in the general fund, the operational portion of the tax rate supports the things like public safety, public works, and parks, and all of our general operating departments. And within the CIP, it supports the debt service payments on the Geo bonds that we issue to fund things like drainage projects, major street rehabilitation, public safety equipment, and facility improvements. So the financial management policy statements have a section on property taxes that we did amend in 2020 after the passage of Senate Bill 2. And so the statement in the policy statement says that as economic conditions permit, and in accordance with the voter approval tax rate, that the city manager will recommend a tax rate equal to a 3.5% adjustment to the tax bill to maintain existing service levels, recognizing that individual tax bills will vary based on a number of factors, including revaluation, residential and commercial revaluation, and exemptions. So we have to look at it as a whole in the aggregate and recognize that every homeowner or every business is going to have a different experience based on what happens with their individual value. So the adoption of the annual budget and tax rate then takes into account growth in the certified tax roll, any adjustments to the nominal tax rate, and we also have adjustments to the homestead exemption as a tool with a long-term objective of stability in the tax rate and predictability of tax bills for our residents. That is the goal. And then for the Geo Bond section of the policy statements, we have in the policy statements state that in the year after a Geo Bond election, that the debt service tax rate will then be adjusted based on the projected impact of the bonds before any projects from the Geo Bond election are funded in the CIP. Obviously, with COVID, we have opted to deviate from this statement with fiscal year 21, and where we phased in the increases to the tax rate. But that was a conscious decision and direction from City Council to do so. In accordance with this, we would have fully implemented the 3-cent tax increase in fiscal year 21 to implement the 2019 Geo bonds.
And in light of this, I mean, obviously when we approved the new wording of the FFPS, we didn't have the pandemic in mind, but in light of this and the way that we've appropriately handled it, I mean, should we look at updating the FFPS to allow, to allow for what, to state what we're doing and be doing for the phase down.
So we review this biannually and we're scheduled to update it in fiscal year 22.
Oh, okay.
So we can look at if you would like to make, and this is council's direction to staff. So if that's something that you all would like to see changed, we can look at that if that's the direction that we get.
Yeah, but this is more of our guidance. So whenever there's times to deviate from it, like how we're calculating sales tax in the budget, the forecast. And so I think the point is it's sound financial management policy statements. And then when we need to deviate, we have that clear, transparent conversation with the council and can have that conversation. But
so we don't even really need to change the word. Okay, so we don't really have to change the word.
Well, we don't. You're right. We do not have to. But if the council would like to through the process, we definitely ensure your statements. So.
Yeah. Okay. No, we didn't. Okay, so we have this slide is an update to, I think you've seen the similar slide before. This is the TML tax and debt survey. This is the 2020 tax rates for cities from 75,000 up to 300,000. And as you can see, we are second lowest tax rate within cities within this population group. And you can see they are pretty much all over the place from the low being Tyler at 26 cents, I think was theirs, up to almost 80 cents in several cities, Abilene, Baytown, and Garland being the three highest. So we continue to carry that distinction of the second lowest.
In the way Sugarland maintains their facilities and the way Tyler does.
Definitely, yes.
Big time.
Big time, yes. And the city of Tyler has historically used their 4B sales tax as their funding mechanism in lieu of issuing debt. And so we have a much more robust economic development program. We have our destination venues where we're utilizing that 4B sales tax for the baseball stadium and, the savings from the recent refunding that we did has been reinvested in the stadium.
Thanks. All right, Mr. Mayor, there's a question on the screen. It's from Councilmember Jacobson. People often conflate the city tax rate with the total taxes they pay. How do Sugarland residents compare with the total overlapping tax to other municipalities?
That is a good question. We will have to, as far as what other municipalities, you have to look at the other overlapping entities. It's so
very, very hard to do.
Yeah. So for within our city, the city tax bill makes up roughly 15% of the total tax bill. If you just have the city, the county, and the school district. If you live in an in-city MUD or a LID, which many of our residents are within a levy district, and many are within, for instance, in Telfair, in Lake Point, they have an in-city MUD, that percentage drops to closer to, I think, 10%. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to add, we have done some analysis over kind of like the total combined tax burden for residents both within Fort Bend County, but also statewide. And so particularly for the residents who don't live within an in-city MUD, in that newer development, we're really, really low. And then statewide or even regionally, our residents benefit from not, like, we have relatively few overlapping taxing entities for our residents. There's not a community college district or a hospital district or those things. And so you really, I think overall, like our research shows that, like in total, the tax burden here, but in particularly the city's tax burden is extremely, extremely low across the state.
Then with our continued low tax rate, you can see that with the implementation of the sales tax for property tax reduction, which was approved by voters back in 1993 and 1995, it was a quarter cent in each of those elections. We have continued to lower the tax rate over the last, 27 years or so. And just recently with the implementation of the 2013 park bonds and then the 2019 Geo bonds have started to see that the increases. But you reach a point when you can't lower the tax rate anymore. But we have utilized our strategies to be able to maintain this low tax rate for a very, very long time. And so we continue to demonstrate that commitment, I think, in our strategies moving forward.
Jennifer, for residents, we have a 12% homestead exemption and you're under 65. So
yes, you are looking ahead on the next slide. So, in conjunction with that, we had a conscious decision back in 2008. We recognized that you can only lower your tax rate so much. That we had a 1% homestead exemption for many years through 2007. It had a $5,000 minimum, and so in 2008, City Council, we raised that to a 5% homestead exemption, which for most homeowners, they did see a significant increase in the amount of the homestead exemption that they're getting dollar-wise. And in 2020, we raised that to 12%, and that was part of that Sugarland Way strategy, where while we raised the tax rate in 2020, we also raised the homestead exemption. So for residents, they saw very minimal impact to their tax bill, and we were able to capture the additional tax revenue from the commercial properties to really rebalance the revenue that we were getting to fund those additions that we had to the budget in 2020. And so that continues for this year.
We raised the residential homestead exemption from 10% to 12% in 2019.
But it was for it was for effective for tax year for fiscal year. These are fiscal years.
Oh, those are fiscal. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah,
well, I'm sorry, they are tax years.
Because the thing is, we had the vote, the second consideration on June 25th of 2019, and as long as you had that, the council had the vote prior to July the 1st of that year, it was supposed to go into effect for that calendar year.
Yes.
So wouldn't it have been 2019?
So these are fiscal years then.
Okay.
I get confused sometimes between the tax year and the fiscal year. They're off a year, and it can be
right. Okay, so this is fiscal year.
So this would be fiscal year.
Okay, and then for the benefit of our new council members, in June 2019, we had talked about last year putting together a long-term strategy for slowly, gradually increasing the residential homestead exemption to 20%. That with COVID, that completely went out the window, and it's still like off the table right now since we're still working on our phased restoration of funding for priority services. But if we ever get back to sort of like a normal situation, then maybe council at some future time can have that discussion that we had planned to have about, I said, a long-term plan to take it to the maximum of 20%.
Yes. And you are correct. So that was part of the fiscal year 20 budget process. So it would have been in June of 2019 when that was increased. So it would have been for tax year 2019, which is fiscal year 20 that's shown there.
Thank you for the clarification.
And I remember the conversation, I don't remember the 20%. Because when you look at 20%, that's a really tall bar when you've got a city where the facilities are aging. I don't ever see us getting 20%.
It was just to have a conversation with council, but I said And that's why there's no point in having this
Can I ask a
conversation.
question on that?
The council had, or the county has 20%.
So 20% is very aggressive, obviously, but what other cities our size has a 12%? Aren't we aggressive at 12?
They run the gamut. So where you have Baytown that has almost an 80-cent tax rate, they have a 20% homestead exemption, but their average home value is around $100,000. So you really have to look at it on an individual basis. And it's very difficult to compare. But that is one of the things that we want to look at going forward. And that will be some of the discussions that we're having with City Council in granting tax relief to residents. The homestead exemption is the only way you can target residences. Because the tax rate has to be equally applied to all properties. And so when you lower the tax rate, essentially you're granting tax relief to all taxpayers, including commercial. And by granting the homestead exemption increase, you can target that reduction to residents. And you can have a corresponding adjustment to the tax rate, which is what we did in 2019. And that essentially works out to no impact or no increase to the residential tax bill because it's offset by the homestead exemption. So
Jennifer, there's a huge, the unknown in Baytown is they have industrial agreements.
Yes.
And to the extent that they lower the tax rate for the residents, the benefit accrues to ExxonMobil in the petroleum industry. So their hands are really tied. I mean, they pretty much, their tax rate is what it is because of the industrial agreements they have in place, and they've negotiated a tax revenue from the industry that if they lower the tax rates of residents, and the industry ends up getting the benefit.
Yeah, so every city has their own unique circumstances, and so that's why it's very difficult to compare. But it is something that we have had conversations about in the past, and if that's something that City Council wants us to look at going forward, we can do that evaluation. Just COVID kind of threw a wrench into everything. Just
not possible.
Wasn't the time to do it, especially while we're in the middle of implementing the 2019 Geo Bonds.
Exactly.
Right.
On the previous slide, one of the things that just a comment that I appreciate what we've done as a city is we've taken these projects and we put it out there for the public to decide what we're going to do. Because prior to that, we were doing certificates of obligation. So we're being very transparent with the needs of the city and putting it out there for the public to decide, what is a priority. And so, when we're looking at the transition from 1993, from lowering the tax rate, and we've got to take into consideration that we are a maturing city and there's not a lot of room to grow that tax base. So I just, as newspapers and residents are watching this meeting, these are things they need to understand, that the city of Sugarland is extremely transparent with our projects, where we are on the timelines, how much we're spending on that. We're much more transparent, in my opinion, than other governmental agencies, in our area. So I appreciate that, the work that staff has done with putting that on our website, so that it's easy for residents to know exactly where that money is going.
Yeah, and you can very clearly see in the chart that, up until 2013, the tax rate was essentially flat at roughly 30 cents. And you really don't see that increase until we started to implement those park bond projects. And then again, until we started implementing the 2019 Geo Bonds with the first increase that we had in 2020, almost half-cent increase. Yeah. All right. So a little overview of the changes that we've seen due to Senate Bill 2. So the truth in taxation comes from the Chapter 26 of the tax code. And so that tax code really defines the terminology that we have to use, the calculations that we have to follow, the deadlines and the processes that we must follow very closely in setting our local property taxes. So in the 2019 session, which was the 86th session, the legislature passed Senate Bill 2. It first was effective with the 2020 tax year. It changed what we have referred to as the effective tax rate for years and years. Is now called the no new revenue tax rate, and what we had previously called the rollback tax rate is now considered the voter approval rate. And the significant change is that under Senate Bill 2, where the rollback rate previously allowed for up to an 8% increase in the maintenance and operations tax rate with a petition process for an election, now the voter approval rate allows for only a 3.5% increase over the no new revenue maintenance and operations tax rate. And if you're going to exceed the 3.5% maintenance operations rate, then essentially you must call an election by August 16th. And this is what it would be for November 2nd election this year. We would have to call the election by August 16th and approve the tax rate by August 23rd, which is 71 days prior to the election. So it essentially scoots everything back about 6 weeks. And so you basically would have to be, and before adopting the tax rate, you have to adopt a budget. So basically we would be having to get ready to adopt a budget within 2 weeks if we were going to be going over that 3.5%. So essentially you have to have all of that lined out like long before you have your certified tax roll and your no new revenue tax rate calculations, because we, like Jennifer said, we just got them, actually haven't officially gotten the certified numbers yet because we got a draft late yesterday, and we're still having some back and forth with the tax office over what are the right numbers. There were some misunderstandings of what our TERS participation was. So we haven't officially gotten those certified numbers yet. So it is a very tight turnaround. So you have to really have everyone on board and know what you're doing if you're going to be going over that 3.5%. Because you would be going out to the public and they have to, would then have to essentially ratify that increase. And so there is one exception, and we did utilize that exception last year. And in the case of a disaster declaration, you can have a resolution directing your tax assessor to calculate the voter approval rate consistent with what is a special district, which allows for an 8% increase. And that is only, and then you don't have to have an election for that. That is only in the case of a federal or state disaster. And then in 2021, the legislature tightened that up and put further restrictions on that. A pandemic is no longer a qualified disaster. And you actually have to have properties that sustained physical damage from whatever the disaster provision was. And if you do utilize that disaster provision, then you're actually penalized in future years. And you have to essentially reduce your future year voter approval rate by whatever percentage you went over the 3.5. So they've made it very difficult to utilize that provision going forward. So we did receive our certified totals the CAD actually certified early. We received our certified tax roll from them on July 23rd. So we have, they send it to us in two pieces. There's the value that is approved by the Appraisal Review Board, and that was 16.76 billion. And then we have 142.6 million that is still under review by the Appraisal Review Board. So we were, very, very close to having all of our values certified. So the total at 100% is 16.907 billion. We have 514.9 million of value that is the incremental value in one of our three TERS, which are TERS 1 is here in Town Square, TERS 3 is Imperial, and then TERS 4 is the area surrounding Smart Financial Center. So we deduct that value because that's the amount that we actually give, that we contribute the taxes that we collect on that incremental value to the TERS.
So then the net assessed value to the city is just under 16.4 billion. And that's at 100% of the ARB review value. The chief appraiser then will tell us, okay, based on that 142 million, this is the amount we think it's going to come out at, which is roughly 93%. So the amount that you'll see in the remaining slides, I have gone ahead and reduced that 142 million to the 93% value. So that's what we're using in, that's what we use for budgeting.
Jennifer, on the TERS, don't we just pledge 50%?
It's 100% for in Town Square, and then in TERS 3 and 4, we're in at 50%, yes. 50%. And so that 514 reflects the 100 and the 50/50.
And TERS, this is TERS 1, Town Square's TERS 1, I think.
Yes.
It actually is coming up on its useful life.
It expires December 31st, 2025. I never thought I would still be here to see the end of it. and like the comment you made the other night, Mayor, about Alan Bogart and Dean Bocek are the only ones understanding the TERS Town Square development. That was the first project I worked on when I came over to the budget office. So I never in a million years thought I would still be here to see the end of that, the life of that TERS. So it is truly good to see a project from start to finish. Do you want to read that, Thomas?
Yes, we got a question from Councilmember Jacobs.
The question is how much are we going to lose through the protest process?
Yes, and so that is the appraiser, chief appraiser's estimate is that we would see 93% of that value come onto the tax roll.
So 7% is the answer.
Yes. All right, so then this value would be using that 93%. So comparing our 2021 certified values to the supplement number 11, and the CAD is continually issuing supplements as they have updates as they certify additional value. And so for the 2020 values, they were at supplement number 11. I believe they may have issued one more supplement after that. It's not very different, so I just left it this one at supplement number 11. So overall, we're looking at on the net residential, and this is all the residential values with the exemptions netted out. So we're looking at a $241 million increase in residential. It's 2.17% increase compared to last year. On the commercial side, we're seeing a $325.88 million increase, or 6.29%. We actually saw a slight decrease in the net auto and ag, and these, the net auto is the leased autos. And so probably what that is a lot of people, or businesses don't have as many leased vehicles in their inventory. So we saw a slight reduction there because the ag, it's pretty consistent from year to year. It doesn't really change much in value. So our overall net taxable value went up $565.62 million. It is right under a 3.5% increase. And then the value within the TERS actually increased from 489 million to 514 million. That's a 25.72 million increase, or 5.26. So the net impact of the value to the city then is we would have 16.382 billion in taxable value that we would be levying taxes on, where we would actually keep the revenue. So around $540 million increase, or 3.41%. So how does that increase break down? So we have a total of $64.46 million in value that is new to the tax roll, meaning it was not in the 2020 tax roll, and so it is new value to us. 43.37 million of that is residential. 21.09 million is commercial. We did see a substantial slowdown in commercial development in between 2020 and 2021. So that kind of makes sense. Revaluation on the commercial side was 204.7 million. Commercial was 337 million. And again, the ag auto had a slight decrease, so 536 million due to revaluation. And we had an increase in exemptions in both residential and commercial. So, and then we have our change within the TERS. So overall, you can see it was about 40% of the increase is on the residential side, around 60% is on the commercial side for that 500
Jennifer,
million.
explain the sales and use tax for automobiles.
So there actually, we don't get anything off of automobiles. The state has a state sales tax on the sale of autos. There is a property tax for autos that are leased. They are considered personal property, but if it is a personal lease, you can get an exemption for that, so then they are not taxed. So the leased autos that are used in a business would be then taxable. They would be considered for personal property. But we don't get anything sales tax.
Because we get no benefit.
Yeah. Right, we get sales tax on the parts that are utilized in their maintenance shops, but we don't get anything from the sale of the vehicles. So then breaking down that new value to the tax roll and looking at that compared to what we've seen over the last 7 years, you can see we are on the low end. And that is pretty consistent with the development activity that we saw with a lot of the slowdowns due to the pandemic. So, breaking down one of our goal measures is we have 70% of our value from residential and 30% from commercial. And actually the goal is to have at least 30% from commercial. So anything over 30% on the commercial side would be meeting the goal measure target. So we actually went up slightly. We have 67.2% of our value coming from residential and 32.8% coming from commercial. So we are still meeting that goal measure target. There was a point in time when we were around 65-35. So when we annexed Greatwood and New Territory, we added a whole bunch of residential. And so part of that Sugarland Way and increasing the homestead exemption was to try to make strides toward getting the commercial back to a greater percentage of our tax roll.
Yeah, and I came on the BZ in 2010 or 2000. It was about 60-40.
Yeah. And a lot of the property, when we annexed, it was probably 90% residential. And so we did see a jump up on the percentage of property that was on the residential side. So this is, we're where we want to be on this. And then looking at revaluation. So as a percent of the prior year's values, so we're looking at the residential revaluation was 1.4. I have this numbers on the slide. Well, I thought I skipped it. So overall, residential revaluation was around 1.5%, and commercial was a little bit under 6%. And you can see historically the averages there, and those colors came out really similar, but the bottom line is the residential revaluation runs right at 3%, and the commercial is a little bit over 4%. So we were a little bit under on our residential revaluation compared to the last 7 years average, and this is just the average for these years, and a little bit higher on the commercial side than what we've been seeing historically. Overall, it worked out to right at around 3% overall, but it's a little higher on the commercial side, a little lower on the residential side. So this is where we get into the fun part, because we have received some draft calculations from the tax office. In fact, I have a signed version that I had to send back, and I found some issues. So it is so hot off the press that it's not even certified yet. So, but you'll see there's still some pending numbers because we don't have those final numbers yet. So overall, this is where this is a 15-page worksheet that we get from the tax assessor, going through the calculations of the no new revenue tax rate. And that's what happens when you have legislators writing tax code. It's very hard to follow, but that's why we have the tax office doing this for us, and they are certified, and they will make sure that we get the right numbers. Our adjusted tax revenue that all these calculations are being matched up against is 57.746 million, and that is taking into account lawsuits that have settled from the 2020 values, as well as refunds and some undisputed values for 2020. So we have still some pretty significant values from the 2020 tax roll that are either subject to court-ordered reductions or are still in dispute from the ARV values. And so that 57 million in tax revenue is adjusted for those values. And then we have our 16.3 billion in adjusted taxable value. So essentially what we're doing is taking the tax rate, the 33.65, and calculating what would be the tax rate that would generate that adjusted tax revenue with the 16.32 and billion in tax revenue. What I can tell you is that with the significant level of court-ordered reductions and just the undisputed values that we have from 2020, that essentially the proposed, what we're talking about, raising the tax rate by roughly a penny for the Geo Bond implementation, is that we would still be about a penny below what the no new revenue tax rate is, even with raising it a penny. So it gives us an unofficial no new tax revenue rate of around 35.5 cents that we to generate under these calculations the same amount of revenue. We could raise the tax rate to it's 35.57 cents is what it's coming out to, and still not be over the no new revenue rate, which in the past, if we were not exceeding that no new revenue rate, we wouldn't have had to have a public hearing or do a lot of these other steps. So we're still trying to work through exactly what, is that the final number, get that certified by the tax assessor, and then figure out what those steps are that we need to follow. And then the voter approval rate, which allows for, I think I've got that in the next slide. Let me go up. So essentially, all of this is still pending. The voter approval tax rate, which allows for the 3.5% increase on the maintenance operation side, is another penny or so higher than that. So we could essentially go up to almost 37 cents on the tax rate without exceeding the 3.5%. So we still need to have some strategy discussions and red team some of these numbers, make sure that we have all the right numbers, and come back to you with a strategy next week and a recommendation on how we want to move forward on that. So
on the previous slide, Jennifer, please. So,
this one.
Yes. That right there. Last year's just tax rate revenue. What could it be if it was adjusted and confirmed, and when can it be confirmed so we have a number to work on?
Mm-hmm. So this is based on the preliminary numbers that they gave me, and that number is not going to change, the 57.7, and that is the numbers that are driving that are the court-ordered reductions and the undisputed value, which equate to about 1.4 billion in value, which is very high. Compared to what we've seen in prior years. And so we want to get the detail behind that, make sure we understand it, and then have those conversations with the tax office before we bring forward a recommendation to you on what to do with that. It's one of those where my jaw fell to the floor when I saw these calculations. It was not at all what I was expecting. And that's one of those things where we don't have the data. And so, it's all going on, with CAD and in the court system, and we don't get it until we get these calculations.
So it's not a number you're expecting to have anytime soon?
I think that number is what it is. We just want to make sure that we can dig into it and make sure we understand it. And so it's one of those where, the numbers are not coming from us, but we want to make sure that we understand them and what the implications of them are. If we need to raise to the no new revenue rate in order to not hurt ourselves going into fiscal year 23, or what are the implications of that and what potentially could happen in next year's calculations. And so we want to make sure that we have a full picture and be able to understand that before we bring a recommendation.
Jennifer Stewart's point is there's an M&O portion of the tax rate, there's a debt service portion, the M&O portion is the one that's being regulated by the state.
Yes.
And not the debt service. Explain the difference in the two so council knows the decision.
Sure. So the debt rate, essentially, we are bound by our bond covenants to set a tax rate that is necessary to repay the debt obligations. That is going to be around 14 cents, give or take, a tenth of a cent here or there. On the final calculation, where the flexibility comes is on the maintenance and operations side. And that is where the 3.5% cap is only on the maintenance and operations side. Our current M&O rate is 20.305 cents out of the 33.65, and we have 13.45, I believe is the debt rate. And so the debt rate will be around 14 cents, based on the calculations that I have from them. The question is, what do we do with that M&O rate, and how much can we shift between the two without being penalized? And so that is where some of the strategy may come in. We may choose, I don't know what some of the strategies were going to be. So we really need to understand, what are the repercussions of the decisions and the recommendations that we make to you going forward, and how those court-ordered reductions and undisputed values could potentially affect us in the future. This is the biggest number I've seen in 20 years that I've been doing this.
Yeah. Stuart asked a question, because are we taking a penny on the debt service side, which is not subject to the M&O and the regulations by the state, or is it blended between M&O and debt service?
Yeah, so part of our strategy would be to shift, we would be shifting some within our existing capacity. Our policy has been to shift from debt to M&O within the 3.5%. Which is what we did last year, and then to show the penny increase on the debt side, because that's essentially where we don't have any growth built into our base tax revenues on the debt service side. So I'll show you that when we go through the debt service fund next week. I've got it very clearly broken out of, this is our base revenue. It's around 22.5 million on debt service, and then show you where that tax increase actually breaks down. And so any growth that we have from revaluation is where we have that ability to shift the revenue from debt to M&O within that 3.5%. And so the increase then would be, the whole penny would be going for debt. But when you're shifting and raising, it gets a little confusing. And so the slide that I was about to show you I will show you the reallocation between the two, and then the penny increase for the Geo Bond implementation.
Jennifer, explain how we insure debt, the fact that we pay off the 50% of principal by the
Yes. So we have a very aggressive repayment schedule. Our policy is that we pay 50% of the principal within essentially the first half of the maturity schedule, which on a 20-year bond is going to be within 10 years. So when we plan for the repayment schedule, it's essentially a flat principal payment. We just distribute it across the 20 years. And what you see is then you have declining interest. So you have bigger payments up front, and then as the payments go on, they get smaller. Within our debt service schedule, and you'll see some charts next week, and that gives us that natural decline in the debt service. And that is what opens up capacity.
different in the city of Houston, which back-end loaded their debt.
Yeah.
So that they now struggle to make their debt payments because they did the exact opposite of what we did. We front-end loaded ours, they back-end loaded theirs.
Yeah. And so the increase is that when we did the Geo Bond Analysis, we're doing $90 million worth of debt with over, we looked out over 5 years. And so essentially we're needing roughly $9 million in debt service capacity over that time. The 3 cents on the tax rate only generates around $4.5 million. If we're generating around 1.6 million per penny. And so the other half of the debt capacity is coming from the naturally declining debt service schedule. And so that's where, with not raising the tax rate all up front, why we had to slow down some of the projects, because it wasn't all coming from that. Some of it was coming from the natural decline in the debt service schedule. But I'll show you some charts next week to illustrate that.
Stuart, to answer your question.
All right. Okay, so then this is where I was starting to show you when we come up with the final recommendation, we'll very clearly show you what we're recommending to shift, and then the penny increase for the Geo Bond projects would be there. So the initial recommendation was the penny increase. And then once we have time to analyze this no new revenue and voter approval rate, we'll come back to you next week with a final recommendation on that. So a lot of these calculations, they're still pending just because I could throw numbers out here, but I don't want to show you the wrong things. So overall, with the penny increase to the tax rate that we would be looking at for the Geo bonds, our average value home went from $378,915 to $384,471, so around 1.47% increase. With the 12% homestead, then the taxable value went from $333,000 to $338,000. The tax bill then would increase around $50 a year. And that would be a combination of the increase from revaluation and the penny increase in the tax rate. So that would be the impact of the Geo bonds that we'd be recommending.
Just say that again, Jennifer. So the increase from revaluation, which we have nothing to do with.
Correct.
And the increase from the tax rate, which we have something to do with, that's actually going to what the voters actually approve. Mm-hmm. So the talking points for the council members are just that. Yes.
So it's $50 a year, $50 increase to the annual tax bill for the average homeowner. It's going from $1,122 to $1,172 per year for the city tax bill. And now this is obviously pending, like whatever your final decision is on the tax rate, what the recommendation is, but this is with the penny increase for the Geo bonds. Okay, so then the next steps, obviously we'll be back to you next week with the final review of the calculations. Then on the August 17th meeting, we'll have an item on the agenda for you to take a record vote on the proposed tax rate. Then that record vote and the notice of the calculations would get published in the newspaper on August 25th. We have a special meeting set for a public hearing on the tax rate for September 14th at 5:30 because once you have that tax rate public hearing, you have to adopt the tax rate within 7 days. And so we're scheduled to adopt the budget and the tax rate on September 21st. And so I don't have the percentage increase, and actually if it's trending the way it looks like, it's going to be a negative increase over the revenue tax rate based on the calculations we're currently seeing. And so all of that's just kind of up in the air right now. But overall impact to the average residential tax bill is around 4.5% or $50 a year. And then, so we do have to do some publications. The notice of tax rates would get published both in the newspaper and would also post it to our website, and it will run on Sugarland TV 16. There's some messaging that has to run continuously for I think 7 days before and 7 days after the public hearing. And so all of that would get posted, and that would include the record vote on the tax rate. Questions on this? More questions? I know we probably have lots of questions, but we'll try to wrap up the rest of it next week once we have final information.
Jennifer, I think item number 3, which was the truth in taxation, that's a table until our next meeting.
No, actually, we can, Thomas is going to give you, there are 2 pieces of information that the tax assessor would like us to record into the minutes, just receipt of those, and if we're ready to move on, I'll let you open up that item, just have a couple slides on that.
Let's go on to item number 3, truth in taxation calculations. 3A, record for receipt of certified values from Fort Bend County Tax Assessor to be used in calculating the no new revenue tax rate and voter approval tax rates for the 2021 tax year. Jennifer Brown. Jennifer.
Right there. Okay, so it's hard to do that one-handed, sorry. All right, so some of the requirements under Senate Bill 2 is that the tax assessor is required to submit certain certifications and calculations to the governing body. And that includes our excess debt collections, our historical and estimated collection rates, and then with the CAD values, they certify the taxable value of new property, the total appraised values of all properties, and the taxable values of all properties. We have received those pieces of information. That information is then used to calculate the no new revenue and voter approval tax rates. And then the tax assessor is required to submit the no new revenue and voter approval rates to the governing body by August 7th or as soon thereafter as possible. We do anticipate getting those today, and then we will bring those back to you and review those with you at next week's workshop. So the excess debt collections, they have the tax assessor is Carmen Turner. She has certified we have excess debt collections of $140,519. The 2021 anticipated collection rate is 99.82%. Historical collection rates for 2020 was 99.82%. 2019 was 100.68%. 2018 was 101.25%. And then our certified values are what I had reviewed with you previously, and we just need to report into the minutes that we have received these items from the tax assessor. So it's very, very simple action. We will not record receipt of the no new revenue and voter approval rate because we do not have that, but we just need to show them that we've recorded those into our minutes. So very, very simple action, but not something we used to have to do, but it's new under Senate Bill. That's it, yeah, and that's it, the first of many cases where legislators, these actions that we have to do. So.
Thanks to City Council and staff. Great first budget hearing. We have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Adjourned at 9:12.